Hello, Tim Wilmot here, and welcome to another watercolor demonstration. This time I'm going to cover simplifying the scene, simplifying a street scene. Why simplify? Well, painting in a loose style, as I do, you ignore detail and you just concentrate on shapes and objects, and you're trying to get the mood of the scene. And a typical street scene may have many objects, windows, architectural details, street furniture like lamp posts and bollards and railings and so on. So we have to try and simplify it to retain that loose style. Now this video is free to watch, not free to produce. If you like these videos, please support me via my Patreon site at www.patreon.com/Tim Wilmot. For a small pledge, I'll be able to bring you high quality full-length watercolor tutorials, and you can send me your paintings in for a critique. As I say, for more details, go up to my Patreon site. More details in the comments below, and I'll give more information towards the end of this video. So the scene here is, I'm back in Venice again, and we've got a typical canal scene. And as you can see, lots and lots of details, lots of people. If you look at all these windows and architectural details here in the background and on the left-hand side, so many. But painting contre-jour, against the light, things can be simplified. We end up with just silhouetted shapes, the silhouettes of people, a very simple bridge shape here with the arch. And in the darkness, a lot of these architectural details will be lost. So when I look at the scene, I think about objects I can remove, things I can replace, things I can move to a different position. I think in this scene, with the railings here, this is one of my own photographs, but with the railings here, it's slap bang in the middle. And if I was to include those railings, they don't really do much for the scene. They're almost splitting the scene in half, with this where the light's hitting the top of the rail and then it's continuing on, and we've got like a line going up the building. It's almost like a demarcation line between the left-hand side and the right-hand side. So I remove that. These boats, I could leave those in, but I'm choosing to remove them and instead have the reflection of the bridge, which I think is nice to have that sort of repetition of the arch of the bridge and the arch of the reflection below that. Of course, I'm going to have people, but simplify. I'm going to reduce the number of people in the scene. I quite like these two people. I may not copy them exactly, but nice to have a couple of people walking towards us. Of course, a few on the bridge as well, as we've got here, and then just maybe the impression of people in the distance. And then with these windows, I'm not going to paint every single window, but I'll try and retain the style of Venetian buildings and some of the trim around the buildings and the horizontal lines and the vertical lines we've got here, and the nice bit of the light frame around these windows as well. Over the left hand side, of course, a little bit more tricky because the sun is just hitting the left hand side here. We're just beginning to catch, the sun is moving around from left to right. It's going to catch more details. We've just got a bit of a shot blind catching the light there, a few little shop blinds that are extended out there, they're catching the light as well. So we'll feature those, but again we try to simplify the left hand side. Actually, where this is in Venice, just in case you're interested, if I just pop into a street view here, where we are is right down here. If I zoom in to this location here, we're on that street there, which is, excuse my Italian, Fondamenta Frari. So there's a little bit of a square here, quite a busy place. Lots of people were going about their business or going from one area of Venice to the other in Venice. And I was located here when I took the photographs. I'm looking towards this building here in the background, silhouetted, and there's the left-hand building there. There's the bridge, and I've got that sort of diagonal view going across. So let's see what we can do. So the paper I'm using is Saunders Waterford. It's cold press paper, medium texture. I'm using a 3B pencil and starting off by getting the figures, the two figures that I want to have as a focal point. That's a good start. Broken my pencil. That's pressing too hard. So these two figures will be a focal point for me, walking towards me. And there we go. Let's just get that second figure in there. And with figures, I normally start with the heads, then a bit of cross-hatching for their face, just to get that right. Get the level of the heads right in relation to other things around them, maybe a door nearby or a top of a window, or if there was a street scene, a car. So just very loosely drawing in these two figures. Don't need to pay too much attention to the legs, but just getting all the proportions right of the figures, an indication of the shadows. And then once I have those figures correctly placed, not too central, maybe just a little bit slightly off the middle of the composition, I can now fill in the rest of the other details, and starting off with just the outline shapes of the buildings, that left hand one, the dark buildings in the background, the side of the, I think it's the archive museum or something like that, and then the curve of this canal. So I've got a bit more of a curve than I had in the photograph. So again, I'm just trying to change things to suit the composition. We've got the top of the bridge there, the iconic sort of three angles of the bridge, the rise, the horizontal top, then the slope down the other side, and then the arch underneath the bridge. Just a few lines to indicate where the reflections will be. And then a few bold marks down the building to indicate, just to help me with perspective and lining up that sort of first floor line. And a few figures on the bridge. So that's one of the main things here. I've reduced the number of people in the scene. Anyone going to Venice, you know there's hundreds of visitors. I mean, this location here, very, very popular. Just a small bit of detail on the bridge. Now a few verticals and just the minutest of details for the buildings for me to follow when I'm painting. So you can see I just very briefly drew in where the windows are going to be, because that's going to be silhouetted, that's in the background, it's in shade. We can't perceive too many details there, so deliberately being very brief with the marks for those windows. So drawing done. Second stage, get in the first wash. And if I could just describe my palette, this is my travel palette. Very limited number of colours. I've got a cobalt blue, I've got a lemon yellow, I've got a Windsor red. It's quite a bright red really. Then a neutral tint. I've also got a little bit of cerulean or violet in there as well, but mainly just those four colours: any yellow, any blue, any red, and neutral tint or Payne's grey. So starting with the sky, just a fairly weak wash of a little bit of yellow, a little bit of red, trying to mimic a yellow ochre, which I don't have here, and then a little bit of blue on top of that. This will dry a good bit lighter than what we see here. And I've gone over the lines of the buildings, so the sky's being dragged over that, which is going to give me nice sort of soft edges to these different colours. There is a slight slope on this board as well, maybe about 10 degrees or so, so there'll be a little bit of gravity taking the wash down. I'm using a Raphael brush. This is a soft aqua mop brush. It's a size, I think it's a size 6, this one. Now, background building, nice warm red. Let's mix it up a little bit, going a little bit yellow on the right hand side. Down to these figures. So what we're doing in this stage is we're just basically covering up the paper, except for a few selected areas around those figures, for example, and maybe some highlights. If I do leave little bits of the paper still showing through, it doesn't really matter. Now with this Raphael brush I can get quite a good point on this, and I'm just adding in, I'm just going fairly close to these figures around the head, and over the shoulders. And while everything's still quite moist, I can be adding in colours above just to break up, just to make sure it's not too monotonous in value and in tone. So that's the first bit of careful painting around that archway. And the street here, just using the side of the brush now, and with this rough texture we can get a few little highlights showing, which could be maybe the sun hitting little parts of the of the pavement here. This brush is not too wet, fairly dry. That's the edge of the street. Now just a little bit under the bridge, and we'll come across. And the water. We'll try and get a little bit darker, a little bit more intense with the colour as we come towards the foreground. So that's why I mix up a little bit more of the blue there. Down to the bottom. And that is almost done. It just needs a little bit more blue in the bottom right corner. So we'll now let everything dry 100% before I go on to the next stage. So I have, I'm just about to speed up this video. You don't want to see me using my hairdryer, so out with the hairdryer, speed up the drying time, and then we'll get on with the darks, try and add a bit more definition to these shapes now. So that wash is dried. You can see it's gone a good bit lighter than what we had before. So sometimes you've got to, in knowing that it's going to dry lighter, you've got to compensate that wash and perhaps going a little bit darker, a bit more intense than you would otherwise, because it is going to go a lot lighter. So now mixing this Windsor red, bit of neutral tint, same brush, which has got a good point to it, as you can see, and holding the brush not too tightly, not like I'm using it as a pencil, right towards the end, which will help with a loose approach. Some of these details of the chimneys and so on. And then down the other side. Then just giving impression of just a few details on the rooftops. A few more chimneys on the other side. So using neutral tint, and careful not to overdo it, but it's a quick way of getting in those darks, which we want to work sort of fairly quickly here with it. So rather than having to mix up like quite a dark mix of blue, like an ultramarine blue, alizarin crimson, maybe a burnt umber to get that sort of warm grey, I'm using the shortcut with the neutral tint. Just done a bit of negative painting around one of the far shop lines, and then carefully down to the shoulder of that figure, and this figure on the bridge. Now I'm holding the brush just closer towards the brush, just to get a bit more control where I had to get a nice edge on the top of the bridge. So returning to the background buildings, I'm just trying to change the combination of colours here. When you look at Venetian buildings, there's so many different colours in them, and I want to try and give the impression of that here. These rich warm colours. Over to the right hand side and then down to street level. Where I'm going to be a little bit darker as I come down to the bottom, just ever so slightly. Maybe the impression of another figure there right on top of the bridge. And just complete right down at the street level here, maybe a few horizontal shadows, and leaving just a few little bits of the paper there, which could be just the impression of some more people in the distance. So we can always use our fingertips just to move the paint around a bit, not too much. So the left-hand building now, and I think it's quite dark right at the top, so we've got a nice bit of contrast between the light sky and the top of that building. Perhaps there's just a little light there at the top just protruding out. So I'm coming on down. It doesn't matter if it bleeds just a little bit with the background, that first building I was doing. This canal does sort of curve around a little bit to the left, and unless you look very closely, it's quite difficult to see the gap between the two sides. So just a few horizontal marks left there to give the impression of some windows. Again, not getting tied up with too many details. So deliberately I didn't draw in all those different window shapes there on the left hand side here. It's not an important part of the overall composition. It's sort of up there in the top left corner. We don't want to be bothering about that too much. We're more interested in around those two figures and the bridge and the reflections. Drag a few lines. Think about perspective a little bit. Those lines are a tiny bit closer together as we go into the distance. Now we've got this shop blind that's hasn't been extended out, it's been wound up, so I'm just drawn there or painted around the wavy edge of that blind, and then we've got a few dark windows right closest to us, but the sunlight is coming towards us, so maybe with a bit of glare we can't really make out too much what's behind those windows, but and there could be a bit of glare as well, a few diagonal lines just to emphasize the direction of that light, and some random shapes. I need to go in a little bit dark behind these figures just to add a bit more definition to them. And I've sort of joined up those blinds behind their heads as well. So that's another thing that I try and do a little bit, is trying to think about how these different objects can be connected up so they're not too standing out on their own. Now this street level, going up to the figures, a few more marks just to give the impression of those windows catching the light. Now a few stripes for the blind. And when all this is dry, we will be going in, or I will be going in with some darker marks just to add a bit more definition and form to the building. Now I've got a smaller mop brush here. Not exactly sure who the manufacturer is. I think it's a Jackson's, but just a small mop brush to help me do these figures. And as I normally do, I paint in their faces first. So I've mixed up a sort of flesh colour, bit of yellow, bit of red. Could have added a touch of blue there just to make it a little bit darker. So in with the faces, a couple of arms, and then a jacket for this person, but thinking about the light catching the shoulders of this figure. So left hand side, right hand side. So using a smaller brush, I've got a bit more control and just trying to maintain just a few little highlighted lines around it, not too many. Still trying to connect that figure with, on the left, particularly on the left hand side, with some of the shadows in the window, and then the legs. And figure number 2, we'll have this one a little bit lighter at the top, but again still retaining the light on the shoulders, the face is just beginning to come down, bleed in with the figure, bleeding in with the torso, the body, and then the legs. Trying to get them different to the first figure. I don't want them to appearing like a synchronized march towards us. And then some shadows. Think about where the sun is above these figures. So the figure on the left, it's going to be, the shadow is going to go out more to the left, whereas the one more centrally placed is going to be coming a little bit more towards us. And that's about it for those figures. Now I'm just doing a bit of splattering here while the paint is still moist. And with the gradient, that would just slowly come down a little bit. I don't think we'll notice that too much in the finished painting, just a few little blotches there. Adds a bit more interest. I have covered splattering in a few other of my watercolor tutorials. Now for this bridge. So going over now with a sort of greyish colour, and I'm holding the brush fairly carefully here to again maintain those lines, just twisting the brush round to use the shape, the edge of the brush. And then the all-important curve. Get that right. Don't need to be too precise on the right hand side because I will be going in with a very dark colour for the bottom of the underneath the bridge. And then continuing over on the right hand side, there's a few little steps leading down to the water's edge. So I'm just giving an impression of that there. Now right hand building, quite dark again as I come down, alternate the blend of colours I'm using, try and get a crisp edge to this. Doesn't matter if it bleeds just a little bit with the background building, it's still maybe just a little bit damp, and that's it, done. So now for some reflections. So I'm trying to make a sort of greeny, a dark green, a dark sort of olive green mix here from these limited colours I've got. Keep mixing. And then the side of that brush, almost at a 45-degree angle, using the edge, we'll just add in some gentle reflections. So just dragging the brush left to right. It's fairly well loaded with paints here. Try not to overdo it. And up to those steps, there's a little bit of bleeding going on, that doesn't matter. And then the reflections of this building as well. So I've got just enough paint to use here. So with that reflection, it's getting a little bit more erratic as it extends down, as it comes towards us. So now for the underneath of the bridge. So carefully follow the lines, and as I'm coming down to the bottom, I'm going wider, so I'm putting more pressure on the brush so it's going wider, and let it bleed in with the reflections I've done. Just dab, everything's still moist, just keep dabbing it around. Basically letting watercolor do what it does, and it's got a mind of its own. So the background building now is fairly dry, and I can now go in with just a few marks to give the impression of these Venetian buildings. Again, the whole object of this video is trying to simplify things. I'm not concentrating on any big detail here. It's in the background, it's in the shade. If we looked at it very quickly, it would just be one dark, warm, dark shape. So I'm just putting in just a few windows here and there. Maybe concentrate on getting a few bold ones. Bigger ones. And then on the left hand side, just as it goes around the corner. Now to help with the perspective again, a few lines down that far building. So this figure on the bridge, let's put in the face, darker clothing. And then this next figure right on the bridge itself. Just a few marks now to indicate the details of the bridge and the balustrade. Just a few little gaps showing between the bridge. And all these bridges in Venice, they all have their own identity, but they have some things in common with that, the top edge to it, and the steps leading up one side and then the horizontal bit then going down the other side. Now while we've got this small synthetic brush, adding a few more details here on the side of the water. As I say, I've done away with those railings. I don't think, for me personally, they weren't sort of adding anything to the composition. With the boats, I'm sort of 50-50 with those. I could have added in one in there, but because I've taken the boats away, I had to imagine where the reflection would be. So I've got a few lines now just to give some definition to the pavement, a few slabs. At some stage I'm going to have to, underneath the bridge, I'm going to have to put in the reflections of that background building. This figure here, the front was too light because we're contre jour here. We need to darken that down a little bit, just a shade. That should be all right. So out with the hairdryer in one hand, brush still in the other. Just make sure that this left-hand edge, this left-hand side is completely dry before I go in with some of the some detailed marks with a smaller brush. Nearly there. And again on the right hand side. So continuing on with the details, small round brush. Just make sure it's dry. So I'm still trying to make sure I'm simplifying the scene, so trying to think of the balance of detail with simplification here. I do need to add in a few dark, the tops of these windows, just to make sure they look like shop windows. Tops are dark, and then just a few sort of random shapes as I come down. Then continue on underneath the blinds. Of course it's quite dark underneath those blinds, so I'll add that in. Gives me a good opportunity to add a bit more definition to the highlight on that shoulder. And then almost joining up with the face. And connecting with the right arm of that figure. And then continuing on again to the next, underneath the next blind, down. That's the other thing we're trying to do here, is add in the highest level of contrast we can between the light areas and the dark areas. So the light areas of the blinds there, and the light hitting the shoulders of the figures. Make this top even darker. Just a few marks, not overdo it too much, because that's almost, it's the top of the picture, it's almost background. A few lines on that second level. Need a few verticals as well, just to break up that area. That should be it. Yeah. Just dragging the brush. A few little extra details on that bridge. And then the water's edge on the far side. Then I need these, of course, the reflection of the building, the background building, which we can see below the bridge. That needs to connect with the reflections of the bridge. So just quickly get this in. It doesn't matter if I just leave a few little highlights there. And we'll just have a few more reflections to break up that area down towards the foreground. I think I'll add a bit more definition to the bottom of these windows. Add in another line there. Perhaps a far figure. Now that right-hand building, which I think is the archive office or something like that, so it's quite a, when you're actually in the square, it's quite a large building in front of you. Just make a few of these lines between the pavement slabs just a bit more defined. I'm just going around with this small brush, just picking up little finer details here and there. I think this blind needs a bit more of a vibrant blue in there. So again, with this small brush, quite thick paint, I'm going to add in a few more stripes, just so that it looks a little bit more convincing as a shop blind. There we go, that's a bit better. So a little horizontal line there coming out, that could be a little street light. I'm picking up on a little patch at the background building there that I left unpainted. So these little gifts, we can pick up on those and turn them into lights or figures. So I'm constantly looking around for those little incidental things that have happened. So I'm nearing the final stages now of the picture. And I quite often use a little bit of white gouache to get some highlights, but first make sure everything is dry, and then with a rubber or an eraser I might just rub out some of the pencil lines that where I haven't painted over the paper, just get a nice crisp bright highlights there, so I don't need to go over that with any white gouache. Obviously make sure the rubber's nice and clean, don't want to get any smudges on there. So with some white paint now, just pick up on a few details, not to overdo it. Figure on the bridge, or two figures. I'll add in some frames around the windows as well, as you often see in Venice. Again, a sort of iconic look to some of the windows with the very ornate tops to them as well. Now, a few verticals for that background building. Not too many, otherwise it would be, we're trying to keep things simple. It's all about how to simplify the scene and just giving the impression of some of those lighter details, those light frames around the windows, not going all the way around the window, but just a few touches here and there. Resist the temptation to go over all of the windows. And there we are. I think we're nearly done. So that's finished. So I'll just now cut over to the finished painting, which is a bit truer to the colours in the painting, a little bit richer here. I've taken this with a different camera to the camera I'm using to video the tutorial, so it's a bit truer to the colours. So it's all about simplifying the scene. When I had that street scene in front of me, I'm looking to think about the composition, looking to objects that I can remove or change their position, or add in extra things as well just to help the composition. Maybe a lamppost that wasn't there, that could be there, that just helps with the balance of the picture. We removed lots of the figures as well. There were some nearby figures in my source photo. I don't want things immediately on the left or immediately on the right, just maybe distracting us from the central portion of the picture. I removed those railings. They just really didn't do anything for me personally. You might think different. Maybe you could make something of that. It would, maybe if there was a gap in the middle of those railings, that might improve things. And I removed the boat as well. I think with hindsight, maybe there could have been a boat, maybe a boat on the far side of the bridge in the background there. That might have been quite nice, just to again lead the eye further afield on through the scene. So I hope you liked the watercolor demo, simplifying the scene. I'd just like to make a special mention to all of the people that have pledged something to me to support me in the production of these watercolor videos. Thanks very much indeed. I do appreciate your support. And for those of you that don't know too much about Patreon, it's a crowdfunding system allowing you to support creators, different creators like me, artists, musicians, so on. My site is www.patreon.com/Tim Wilmot, but up there you'll see different levels of support, and most of those levels I will give something back to you. So in return for your support, I will give you I will submit different painting projects from time to time, normally on a monthly basis, or certainly every 2 months. And you can actually then attempt those painting challenges or projects. Email me your a photo of your painting, and I'll give you a personal critique back. And in fact, some of my levels allow us to speak personally on a one-to-one basis. As I say, more details, go up to Patreon and the Tim Wilmot site. If you want to see more of my work, go to timwilmot.com. You'll see more details of the workshops and some of the painting holidays I do as well. But thanks very much for watching, and catch up with you next time. Thank you very much indeed.